Rain, Rain by Anne Martin. Chapter 8. In my classroom. My classroom faces southeast and has windows along one side and 21 desks for students plus Mrs. Cushell's desk plus Mrs. Liebler's chair, which sits next to my desk and blocks the aisle. There are 11 girls and 10 boys in my class. There are 2 gerbils in my class. Our classroom rules are written on a sheet of oak tag which is posted next to the door of our room. Mrs. Cushell smells of apples and has a husband and a girl who is 6 and has a prime number named Eddie, 23. Mrs. Cushell knew last spring that she was going to get me as her student, and she scheduled a conference with my father, who said, "I promise Rose won't be any trouble." When Mrs. Cushell asked what my father does about my tantrums at home, he said, "Rose doesn't have any tantrums at home, not while I'm around. She knows better." And then he said, "Ha ha, just kidding." I know this because I was sitting in the waiting room outside the school psychologist's office, and I could hear every word of the conference. I hear lots of things I'm not supposed to hear, and lots of things nobody else is able to hear, because my hearing is very acute, which is a part of my diagnosis of high-functioning autism. The clicks our refrigerator makes bother me, and so does the humming sounds that comes from Mrs. Cushell's laptop computer. One day in school I put my hands over my ears and said, "I can't concentrate, please turn that thing off." "What thing?" asked Mrs. Liebler. "I want Mrs. Cushell to turn off her computer," I said clearly, in the way Mrs. Liebler has taught me. "Tell me clearly what you want, Rose," Mrs. Liebler says when I'm out of control. "Why do you want her to turn it off?" asked 4-foot, 10-inch Josh Bartell, who sits in front of me. "Because of the humming." "I don't hear anything," said Josh. "Rose, settle down," said Mrs. Liebler. "I hear clicks and humming and whispers and conversations in the psychologist's office when the door is almost closed." Mrs. Cushell has been my teacher for 25 school days now. On the afternoon of day number 25, she announces to her class, "I have an assignment that will be fun for you. You're going to write a composition about a pet." "I don't have a pet," says Flo, whose name is easy to remember because of the homonyms Flo and Flo. Mrs. Cushell smiles, which is her way of saying that she doesn't mind that Flo interrupted her. "That isn't a problem," she replies, "because you may write about any pet at all. If you don't have your own pet, you may write about an imaginary one or someone else's pet." Mrs. Cushell passes out paper, and I find my pencil and stare at the door for a while. "Rose," says Mrs. Liebler. "I'm thinking," I say without looking at her. I start writing about rain. I try to remember what Mrs. Cushell has said about themes and what Mrs. Liebler has said about not working homonyms into every theme. "Time's up," Mrs. Cushell says after 21.5 minutes. "Who would like to read aloud to the class? It doesn't matter if your composition is finished, just read what you have so far. You can finish your work at home tonight." 3 girls and 2 boys raise their hands. Mrs. Cushell calls on Flo, who reads about a pet she has made up in her head called a chickapoo, which is a cross between a chicken and a poodle. Flo says her chickapoo doesn't cluck or bark, it clarks. Everyone laughs. While I think about the clarking chickapoo just long enough to figure out that chickapoo is not a prime number word, but a word that is 81, which means it's divisible by 3. So it's not as good as a prime number, although it's interesting. The next person to read is Josh Bartell, who has written about his 4 neon tetra fish. "My mom picked out the first fish for my sister and I last summer," he says. I interrupt him right there. "Mrs. Cushell," I cry. "Mrs. Cushell, Josh broke a rule. He wrote for my sister and I, and that's not right." "Rose, what have we said about interrupting?" "But he was supposed to write for my sister and me. Me. I isn't always correct." "Rose, that's a comment you might make later when Josh has finished reading," says Mrs. Cushell. And Mrs. Liebler says quietly to me as Josh continues with his composition, "You might think about telling him something positive first and then pointing out his mistake." I put my head down on my desk. "Rose," Mrs. Liebler whispers. I don't raise my head. He didn't pay attention to the rules. I can feel tears in my eyes. "Rose." "Mrs. Cushel clearly told us about that rule on September 17th, I say loudly into my arms. "Do you need to step into the hall?" I stand up suddenly and my chair shoots backward and slams into Morgan's desk. "Hey!" she cries. I hit the right side of my head with the heel of my hand. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Josh is still reading about his neon tetra fish, but most of the class is looking at me now. "Come on," says Mrs. Liebler, and she steers me to the door and into the hall. "You need to settle down. I imagine that my father will read about this in Friday's report."